Fast Girls, a novel of the 1936 Women's Olympic Team by Elise Hooper. Inspired by the true story of the trailblazing female athletes of the 1936 Olympics. Berlin, 1936, 3 women arrive in Nazi Germany from the United States to compete in the Summer Olympics under Adolf Hitler's watchful eye. Each traveled a different road to arrive at this phenomenal moment, overcoming obstacles, opposition, and even a near-fatal accident. Now they are prepared to show the world what fast girls can do. 1. July 1928, New York City. Before they left the Prince George Hotel, Betty's mother warned her to be careful aboard the steamship and avoid the girls from California. Apparently, they were a loose set, something to do with year-round sun and mild temperatures softening one's moral fiber. Up until that point, Betty had only been half listening, but now she perked to attention. A roommate from some glamorous-sounding location like Santa Monica or Santa Barbara, wouldn't that be a lark? With a series of decisive clicks, Betty fastened the latches closed on her suitcase and started for the door. Maybe if she was lucky, some of those objectionable girls from California would be in her cabin mates, aboard the SS President Roosevelt. Minutes later, Betty and her mother, Mrs. Robinson, sat in the back of a taxicab on their way to Pier 86. A heat wave had been pressing over New York City for a week, and Betty fanned herself while her mother fussed with their taxicab driver over the best route to take. Traffic clogged the street, and newspaper boys hawked their wares, bobbing from one stopped vehicle to the next. Their driver bought one and rested it against the steering wheel, studying the headlines. "Are you sure this is the fastest way?" Betty's mother huffed. "Ma'am, if there was a faster one, we'd be taking it, I promise. Now pray to the Virgin Mary that my engine doesn't overheat." He crossed himself. As if on cue, the automobile shuddered and her mother inhaled sharply. "Pray all you want, but my daughter simply cannot be late. She's on the Olympic team set to depart for Amsterdam at noon." "That's so." He turned around to inspect Betty. "Please, sir, keep your eyes on the road," her mother said. "But we're not moving." Her mother folded her arms across her chest. "So I noticed. I didn't realize there were lady Olympians." "This is the first year women will be competing in running events," her mother said, and though she still sounded annoyed with the man, the unmistakable pride in her voice made Betty sit straighter. The Best American Short Stories 2020, selected from U.S. and Canadian magazines by Curtis Sittenfeld with Heidi Petalor. To read their stories felt to me the way I suspect other people feel hearing jazz for the first time, recalls Curtis Sittenfeld of her initial encounter with the Best American Short Stories series. They were windows into emotions I had and hadn't had, into other settings and circumstances and observations and relationships. Decades later, Sittenfeld was met by the same feeling selecting the stories for this year's edition. The result is a striking and nuanced collection, bringing to life awkward college students, disgraced public figures, raunchy grandparents, and mystical godmothers. To read these stories is to experience the transporting joys of discovery and affirmation, and to realize that story writing in America continues to flourish. Selena Anderson, Godmother Tea, from Oxford American. Just like my mama, she rolled up with a gift, a life-size mirror edged by Baroque curling leaves, with slender gold feet that somehow supported both its shimmering weight and mine. My mother has a knack for messy presents. Day passes to the gym, Mary Maid's coupons, flat irons with built-in conditioner. This, however, was especially rude. A mirror would only reflect me, plus all my sulky auras, plus the cultivated environment that had drawn me this way. My mother had refused help as she dragged the mirror into my apartment herself, claiming it had the power of making the place look bigger. But I didn't want anything of mine to look bigger. The center of my apartment was empty, as spotless as a bald spot, and I liked that. That was my choice. I'd gotten used to that. But now my mother's charity of inherited furniture crowded the room. There was a Chesterfield sofa, end tables with bloated glass lamps, a dining table with a fleet of cane-back chairs, and a roll-top desk that wore a pair of pink soft-grip dumbbells like a tiara. None of this stuff was mine, but at the same time, it was all I had. I know a lot of people just starting out don't have anything, so I don't mean to sound ungrateful, but to my eye the mirror only doubled what I had never really wanted to begin with. Now there was hardly any space to move around. I could never tell my mother this, especially as she was positioning it between the windows and cleaning the glass with newspaper in a quick squealing arcs, so I'm telling you, it was all beginning to be a bit much. But since the mirror was standing there, I'd sometimes creep up late at night to wordlessly articulate a complaint I'd been having with myself. The objects of my apartment looked on as I stood ballitically searching my figure for bad news. My reflection belonged to too many other people, mainly the people who used to own all this stuff. Through me, my ancestors gave eyes to my jacked up third position. I'd switched to tree pose, clutching a glass of rosé to my chest like a good luck charm. My dead relatives studied me in loving disapproval. I'd smiled back until it became impossible to recognize myself. Even my people who are still living don't let me suffer the way I want to. A lot of them, much older and less bothered than myself, express pride in the way I'm turning out. My mother's friends talk about me like I was a dish that was difficult to get just right. But the special ingredients of an elite social circle, good home training, and private education have turned me into a well-spoken young woman full of potential. After my mother had given me the mirror, we walked down the street to a cafeteria in my neighborhood. At the table, I tried explaining to her what it feels like every time a member of her generation pays me a compliment. It never feels good, I said, when a compliment is self-reflective. Patricia Heaton became one of America's most recognizable moms after starring as Deborah Barone in the hit CBS sitcom Everybody Loves Raymond. Heaton's celebrated career continues with her return to CBS in Carol's second act. The sitcom follows divorced 50-year-old Carol Kenny, played by Heaton, who upon retiring as a teacher decides to pursue her dream of becoming a doctor. Heaton knows something about what it's like to stage a second act. Just like Carol, when Heaton's children left the nest, she found herself with an empty house and some space in her calendar. Shortly after, she took a leap in her career, and for the first time, Heaton is now both the star of her own show and the executive producer. Beyond that, what she really considers her second act is her humanitarian work as an ambassador for World Vision, fulfilling a desire to be hands-on with charity work that she placed on hold decades ago. In your second act, Heaton shares wisdom from her personal journey as well as insights from the second act stories of people across the country. You'll read inspiring accounts that highlight the strength of the human spirit to overcome obstacles and achieve great dreams. People from all walks of life surmounting financial hurdles, breaking life's limits, defying disabilities, giving back globally, serving the underserved, and finally fulfilling the deepest desires of their hearts. From changing careers to changing the world, the results are heartwarming, inspiring, and surprisingly relatable, filled with anecdotes and practical steps to help you discover your own path. Your second act shows us that midlife doesn't have to be about crisis when you focus on opportunity. If you are in transition, if you feel dissatisfied, or you have a stirring inside that there is more, this book is for you. Be encouraged and inspired to step out and follow what's in your heart, because she's never too late or too early to stage your second act. Chapter 1. In the beginning, my first act. Life is either a daring adventure or nothing at all. Helen Keller. Bread, booze, and burrata. If anyone would have told me a few years ago that I would be giving up my 3 most favorite things on the planet, hubs and boys excluded of course, I would have taken you straight to the nearest psych ward, because that's just pure craziness. But getting old makes you do crazy things. Or is it that you've finally become sane and realized what matters most? In any case, here I am today, over 2 years without my gorgeous, old-fashioned, my caprese salad, or my brioche loaf. Why, you might ask? Well, like with so many other things, I blame it on my kids. I'm 62, and my boys don't seem anywhere near having children, or even steady girlfriends yet. It would be a good 10 to 15 years before that happens, if it happens. That would put me firmly in my 70s by the time I get to be somebody's nana. God forbid I'm a drooling, wrinkled sack of bones propped up in a rascal, receiving the reluctant but compulsory peck on the cheek from little frightened grandkids. So because my body and mind are in decline, I decided I need to do everything in my power to keep death at arm's length and keep myself in tip-top shape, even if it means saying goodbye to gorgonzola, farewell to French toast, and so long to Sauvignon Blanc. Now, no one is guaranteed a single day of life, but assuming I have at least a few years left, God willing, I want to make the most of them. But there's another reason I wanted to make some changes. The glorious years of raising my family are behind me, and during the time I was deep into them, I didn't have much time for anything else other than acting. Now that the boys have more or less launched, some space has opened up in my life to explore those other interests that were put on hold 20-some years ago. Now, if I could only remember what they were, just kidding. I have lived a life beyond my wildest dreams, and I'm so grateful. Life wasn't handed to me on a silver platter by any stretch. I've worked hard, skinned my knees, cried my eyes out, regretted, doubted, and second-guessed myself along the way. Handing everything over to God changed my life. I've gone up and down many different paths, and looking back, I see how the seed for my second act was clearly planted in my first act. I think you'll find the same is true for you too. My first act was, and still is, of course, acting, which has been my passion since I can remember. I heard passion described like this: when you do what you love to do at a moderate level, you can call it a hobby, but when you go all out with it to the point that someone deems you one step short of crazy, that's passion. The Gates of Athens, a novel by Conn Iggulden. Evoking two of the most famous battles of the ancient world, the Battle of Marathon and the Last Stand at Thermopylae. The Gates of Athens is a bravura piece of storytelling by a well-acclaimed master of the genre. The new epic historical novel by New York Times bestselling author Conn Iggulden, where in ancient Greece an army of slaves gathers on the plains of Marathon. Under Darius the Great, King of Kings, the mighty Persian army, swollen by 10,000 warriors known as the Immortals, has come to subjugate the Greeks. In their path, vastly outnumbered, stands an army of free-born Athenians. Among them is a clever, fearsome, and cunning soldier-statesman, Xanthippus. Against all odds, the Athenians emerge victorious, yet people soon forget that freedom is bought with blood. 10 years later, Xanthippus watches helplessly as Athens succumbs to the bitter politics of factionalism. Traitors and exiles abound. Trust is at a low ebb when the Persians cross the Hellespont, an ever greater number in their second attempt to raze Athens to the ground. Facing overwhelming forces on land and sea, the Athenians call on their Spartan allies for aid to delay the Persians at the treacherous pass of Thermopylae. Prologue. The dust of mountain flowers lay thick on the air, like perfume or boiled varnish. Living things panted in the shade. Goat's thorn grew on all sides, with scrub grass and bare rocks too hot for anything alive to rest upon. Crickets creaked and sang in the branches of pines that clung to stone and somehow endured. Into a stillness as old as the hills around them, music sounded as a faint thread on the air. swelling into something that rang with brass and voices raised in song. Lizards scuttled out of sight as the king's dancers reached the crest, making the air tremble with cymbals, pipes, and drums. At a single order they halted, panting and dripping with sweat. The king himself came forward on his stallion, dismounted with the hint of the grace he had known as a young man. Darius tossed the reins to a slave and clambered onto a huge flat stone to stare over the plain. From that height he could see the scars of the land, the marks of war and fire. He frowned, moved by both the distance and the closeness of the past. He had stood in that same place 30 years before. In that moment it seemed as if he could take a single step and be there once again, with his father at his side, and his life all ahead. Ruins lay where the city of Sardis had been. The flames had died down long before, though when a whisper of breeze rose, Darius thought he could smell char on it, a scent of burned bricks or perfumes or rot. There were people, too, in the distance. The air was so clear, Darius could see the sparks of cooking fires, with thin trails of smoke rising above. No doubt some of them had run, only to return when the conflagration had died down, or perhaps they had come to loot the ruins, searching for beads of gold that had once been coins. The funeral pyre of a city could never be a small thing. On that day, from the height and distance of the mountains, it was hard to imagine entire streets and parks and districts consumed in flame. The watchtowers along the great wall had fallen, Darius saw, spilling their stones. Roads too stretched away from the walls, clearly marked. The steps of families had carried ash and soot, making dark trails like the veins in an old man's arm. The king knew pestilence would stalk there now. Those who had survived cared nothing for the dead, not without leadership. Flies crept over corpses, and the living hurried past, desperate not to see. The great king did not wince or shake his head at the thought. He had known death before, many times. He knew his workers would have to bury the fallen in vast, shallow pits outside the city before they could even begin to rebuild. Darius turned at last, looking to include his young son in his deliberations. Xerxes sat some way back from the front ranks, one leg tucked beneath the other as he balanced on the shoulders of a young bull elephant. Darius saw the boy was distracted by something, perhaps one of his pets. Xerxes could always find some creature to train and amuse him. The most recent had been a cricket, the one before a tiny blue lizard that held food in both hands to devour it. The great king had never felt the need for such things himself. He worried the boy was not concerned enough with the empire he would inherit. He sighed. The cares of a father were legion. The royal procession had come to a halt at his gesture. Having climbed steadily all morning, relief shone in their faces. Behind the king stood 60,000 men, back and back, reaching so far down the trail he could not see an end to them. Darius had come prepared for war, but found only ashes. Thank you for listening. If you're interested in this book, please go to hendersonlibraries.com. Thank you.